3 in the morning, 14,000 feet, a Delta Force team on a ridgeline, eastern Afghanistan, disguised as local fighters, listening to a radio. The voice coming through is Osama bin Laden. The CIA had flown in their foremost voice analyst for exactly this moment, a man who had spent 7 years studying bin Laden's speech patterns. He listened and confirmed it immediately. Bin Laden was somewhere up that mountain, close enough for his radio to reach them. Fewer than 100 American commandos were on the ground. The most wanted man on the planet was cornered in a cave fortress 12 miles from the Pakistani border. A request for 800 Army Rangers was already sitting on someone's desk in Washington, enough to seal the mountain passes and make escape impossible. It was going to be denied. His voice would come through that radio 4 more times before this story ends. The first time, the Americans will celebrate. The last time, there'll be nothing but static. Within 72 hours, bin Laden would be gone, and the people who let it happen would spend years pretending it was never really their call. Before you can understand how he walked out, you need to know what he walked into. Because Tora Bora wasn't just a hiding place, it was a trap, designed partly by the Americans, built by bin Laden himself, and paid for in part with CIA money. In the 1980s, the Mujahideen turned the cave networks in the White Mountains southeast of Jalalabad into a fortress. Bin Laden was part of that effort. He brought in money and equipment, dug out tunnels so fighters could move between positions unseen, with some rooms carved 350 feet into solid granite. The fighters reinforcing those mountains were being funded through the CIA's Operation Cyclone. The fortress that would one day hide the most wanted man on Earth had been built in part with American money. He knew this terrain better than any map could show. He had spent years learning every ridge, every path that traders and smugglers had used for centuries to cross into Pakistan. When the US began bombing Afghanistan in October 2001, there was never really a question about where he would go. The CIA tracked his movements by early November. Vice President Cheney acknowledged publicly that bin Laden was likely in the area. By the end of November, he had arrived with somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 fighters. Everyone knew where he was. The question was, what were they willing to do about it? The Delta Force unit at Tora Bora was commanded by a major who would later write the definitive account of the battle under the pen name Dalton Fury. He brought with him roughly 90 operators, supplemented by 14 Green Berets, a handful of CIA paramilitary officers, and a dozen British commandos from the Special Boat Service. Together, they set up in a former schoolhouse at the base of the mountains, dressed in local clothing, carrying local weapons, beards grown out to blend in with the fighters around them. The actual ground assault would not be theirs to make. Hundreds of Afghan militia fighters, hired and paid by the CIA, were the ones expected to climb the mountain and take it. The Americans would guide them and call in the bombs, but the force meant to physically close on bin Laden was Afghan, and that detail would decide everything. A CIA operative pulled a radio off a dead Al-Qaeda fighter, giving the Americans a direct channel into the group's internal network. Al-Qaeda fighters on the mountain had abandoned basic radio security entirely. They were broadcasting movements, positions, and casualties in the open, and the Delta team had a real feed into all of it. They could hear bin Laden's men talking to each other as clearly as a phone call. What made it stranger was the timing. It was Ramadan. Every evening, the Afghan militia fighters they were relying on stopped fighting. They retreated down the mountain to break their fast and left Al-Qaeda to move freely through the passes after dark. The mountain that looked surrounded during the day opened up every single night. The bombing, at least, was relentless. On December 9th, an MC-130 combat Talon transport plane dropped a 15,000-pound bomb known as the Daisy Cutter on the Tora Bora cave complex. The weapon was first built to clear jungle in Vietnam, and the Americans were now using it to collapse caves. It had been rolled out the back of the plane on a parachute, so the aircraft had time to clear the blast radius. A captured Al-Qaeda fighter later told interrogators that men deep in the caves had been vaporized in what he called a hideous explosion. Over the radio, Fury's team had fighters calling for trucks to move the wounded, frantic messages about caves being too hot to reach, and then Bin Laden's own voice, apologizing to his men for getting them trapped, telling them it was okay to surrender. Fury thought it was over. It was a ruse. Gary Berntsen was the CIA's senior paramilitary commander in Afghanistan, and he had one problem with the entire operation from the start. The people they were relying on to finish it were not going to finish it. The two Afghan warlords the CIA had paid to lead the ground assault were rivals who barely trusted each other. One of them, Haji Zaman, was a recently returned exile and reportedly a drug smuggler whose loyalty was openly questioned by American officers. Every night, his fighters and the others retreated down the mountain for Ramadan. Every night, the passes Bin Laden needed stayed unguarded. Bernstein's request was specific. 800 Army Rangers deploy them immediately to the eastern passes between Tora Bora and the Pakistani border. Attack from the front, seal their exits at the back. Classic. Executable. He sent the request up the chain. He repeated it. He later wrote that he used exclamation points in his official field reports, which career intelligence officers simply do not do. We need Rangers now. The opportunity to get Bin Laden and his men is slipping away. He was not alone. General James Mattis, commanding Marine forces in the region, separately requested to send 1,200 Marines to seal the border. That request was denied. The decision came from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks. Their war plan was built on what they called the light footprint. Small elite teams, no large conventional deployments. The theory was not irrational. It had worked brilliantly to topple the Taliban in under 2 months. It was simply the wrong instrument for this specific 12-mile problem. The Rangers were never sent, and neither were the Marines. While Washington argued doctrine, Bin Laden was already moving people off the mountain, and every night that mountain opened up and the passes stayed empty, the clock ran down. On December 11th, Bin Laden's voice came through the radio again. He told his men the fight was over. He had let them down. It was okay to surrender. Fury let himself believe it for a moment. And then Warlord Zaman called in a ceasefire. He had been on the phone with Al-Qaeda representatives and assured the Americans that the fighters were ready to give up. US commanders smelled the ruse immediately and objected. The ceasefire went through anyway. The bombing paused overnight to avoid killing men who were supposedly surrendering. They were not surrendering. They were moving. 3 days later, on December 14th, Osama bin Laden sat down and wrote his last will and testament. He told his followers that the love of death in the cause of Allah had dominated his entire life. He wrote to his children, "I am sorry for the amount of time and effort I've given to jihad. To my children, forgive me." He wrote it like a man composing his final words, fully expecting to be dead before the week was out. He wasn't dead before the week was out. On or around December 16th, 2 days after writing that will, Osama bin Laden walked out of Tora Bora on foot through a snowstorm, surrounded with a small group of bodyguards around him, through the Parachina corridor, across the passes that had never been sealed because the Rangers were never sent into Pakistani's unregulated tribal belt, 12 miles from where the Delta Force was still watching the wrong side of the mountain. The NSA picked up his voice one final time inside Afghanistan. And then, total silence. Bin Laden spent the next 9 years rebuilding Al-Qaeda from a compound in Pakistan financing and inspiring attacks across the world for an entire decade. The war in Afghanistan, conceived as a swift campaign with one clear objective: become a 20-year occupation that cost over $2 trillion and thousands of American lives. In November 2009, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee published a declassified report, Tora Bora Revisited: How We Failed to Get bin Laden and Why It Matters Today. The finding was direct. Bin Laden had been within reach. The failure was not bad luck or impossible terrain. It was a specific decision made by specific people to protect a doctrine at the moment the mission required something else. The Senate confirmed what Berntsen and Fury had been saying for years. There were enough troops in and near Afghanistan to execute the operation, but nobody sent them. The man who commanded Delta Force on that mountain never let the story die. He wrote the first real account of the battle, hiding behind the pen name Dalton Fury. His face disguised on television because the work was still sensitive. Later, he wrote under his own name. It was Thomas Greer. He died of cancer in 2016, having spent his last years insisting the most wanted man on earth had been within reach and that someone chose not to close the door. Go back to that ridgeline, December 2001, 90 commandos, the most wanted man on the planet, cornered in a fortress 12 miles from the border. The CIA was certain he was there. Delta Force was certain. The Senate confirmed it 8 years later. The request for reinforcements was sent. It was denied. And 2 days after writing what he believed was his final will, Osama walked out of a snowstorm and vanished for 9 years and 5 months. In May 2011, Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden at a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The operation was called Neptune Spear. It became one of the most celebrated military moments in modern American history. If this stayed with you, we cover the stories that shape the world we live in. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Till next time, this is Vantage.